Zach, we are back today. We are diving into some more trading strategies, but today we're looking at the mistakes side of things, mistakes to avoid when you're trading in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Some of the worst things that could happen in Dynasty is making some of these crucial mistakes. And at the end of the day, we want to avoid them. But something else you want to avoid is not hitting that like button or leaving a comment down below some mistakes you're trying to avoid in your Dynasty League, some mistakes you maybe made in the past, some mistakes that you really enjoyed from this video or that you've taken from other videos, so on and so forth. Let's help out the community. Let them know what mistakes you're avoiding. But first and foremost, let's get into this video. Avoid taking any more time. Zach, I want to hear your first mistake here. This one's great. Can't get enough of this one. Dive on in.
Avoid trading because you're bored. We see this all the time where, and the way to identify this is go to a player's history and view that like trade, like let's, just pull up Travis Etienne in your league and see the trades that are listed on there. And sometimes you see an owner trade for and trade this player 2-3 times in an offseason. It's like, dude, make up your mind. Now, listen, sometimes I understand that from like February to June, things change, situations change, et cetera, et cetera. But we all know a boredom trade when we see it. It's a long off season. People get antsy. They miss the dynasty component of it, the game component of it. The way to fix this, Bob, is have a plan, know the plan, stick to the plan. Most boredom trades come from talking yourself into a player or out of one. And a lot of times this happens when we stray from the path, so to say, of our plan. And I'm going to give you another solution here to fix this, Bob. And this is going to be unpopular because I hear this all the time. Like, oh, I have too many leagues. Blah, blah. No, you don't if you're doing boredom trading. A quick solution is join more leagues. Join more leagues. That'll keep you away from doing boredom trades if you have a lot of leagues to pay attention to. Now, look, I'm not saying if you have 35, join more leagues. It's probably enough. But a lot of times the situation is just, hey, like have another team to fix. Pick up an orphan team. Orphan teams are like, the team's already at rock bottom for the most part. So if you do a boredom trade with an orphan team, it doesn't really hurt you. So again, know the plan, stick to the plan, or if you're not in enough leagues, pick up an orphan team, see what you can do.
Yeah, I like this point a lot. I think if you're making trades out of boredom, you're just opening yourself up to what could be value loss, is something we'll discuss over the course of the video. But you're that much more likely to either make trades that are just not on point value wise. You're more likely to have to overpay. You're more likely to sell low just to get a deal done, because that's why you're going to trade. You're trading to go get a deal done, to get your fix, so to speak. I love the idea of going and getting an orphan team because there's so much tinkering you can do with an orphan team that it should take up most of your time. And if you want to get into some orphan leagues, head up patreon.com/rewind, hop in the Discord. We got orphan teams in there all the time. People needing to fill leagues, people wanting to start up leagues already for next year and for the rest of this year. Guys are out of control in there sometimes. But either which way, love this point. Don't just sit down to trade because you're bored. Find other ways to bide your time. I like the idea too of having the plan that you're working with, stick to it. And if you're making a trade that fits that mold of the plan you're in, fine. I think there is a fine line to draw between just trading too dang much or trying to send out too many offers or just spamming offers. And I think making smart trades is probably one of the best things you could possibly ever learn in Dynasty, and not just like we're kind of discussing here, trading just to trade. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Zach, I'm going to dive into this next one. This is a mistake I see all the time. I see it in the YouTube comments for almost every single video, asking if they've won the trade. They'll drop a trade offer. We love chiming in on trade offers, but the answer is not to win the trade. Stop trying to win the trade. If that's what you're out there trying to do, you're trading incorrectly. Now, reason being, it takes two to tango for a trade to happen. If you're having trouble getting deals done, worrying about winning that trade can be one of those things holding you back from getting more deals done. When I started in Dynasty, and even in fantasy football, hell, one of my first things was always trying to never give up anything to get something. And now that's not always what trying to win the trade looks like, but usually it's something to that effect where you're just giving up far less talented players for more superior ones. But if you're just trying to take every trade partner to the cleaners, you're going to halt any progress you could be making, trying to fix your team, trying to add more players or whatever the case is. And the most important part of that is you can damage future negotiations, because if you establish a image of being a trader who's fair, reasonable, willing to negotiate, willing to talk, willing to work through a deal, somebody's going to be willing to come to you more frequently to get a trade done if they need help, if they need, if they can clearly see that you're a rebuilding team, but you have Michael Thomas kicking around and they need a flex piece for a couple weeks because of an injury. They'll know that you'll be reasonable when it comes to that offer because you've established that rapport. You've had that dialogue, Zach. I know you love to talk dialogue, but if you don't, if you're just, well, it's going to be a first round pick. Sorry for Michael Thomas, even though it's incredibly unreasonable to ask for a first round pick for Michael Thomas at this point. That's the type of thing we're trying to avoid, overvaluing players, whatever the case is, however you want to discuss it. You have to understand that accomplishing a trade, the fix here is you have to understand that accomplishing a trade is a team effort. It takes two to tango. Set aside the fact that you are competing teams. At the end of the day, you want to crush this guy. I get it. But that can be done on Sundays. That can be done, Thursday through Monday in the score box. Don't worry about beating them in this one singular trade while you're halting both of your teams getting better. And yes, both of your teams are getting better, but you need to construct a trade that's a win for both teams, and you'll immediately make more trades and win. Frame your mindset to win by just bettering your team and your direction, not beating your trade opponent, or trade partner is what it should be, not your trade opponent. It's your opponent on game days, but not when you're trying to get deals done. You need to work as a team. You need to be partners, help each other out to get good deals done. That's how you're going to get more deals done. If you're struggling to get deals done, it's because you're trying to win the trade. I can almost promise you that. Or the person you're working with might be trying to win the trade too much. Either which way, super toxic mindset, super toxic trait to have. It's easy to do. I'm not saying you're a crap person if you're trying to win the trade. It's just kind of natural to not want to give up something to get something. But to get a deal done, that's what you have to do. You have to set aside the fact that your opponents better both teams, create a trade that's good for both sides. Zach, I'd love to hear your thought here.
Yeah, we definitely know when you get an offer, when that mentality is on the other side of the screen. So it's definitely something where it goes to, and I love that you brought it up and that it wasn't me. Future relations and how dialogue, like there are certain people that send me an offer in Dynasty in my different leagues where I get the notification and I'm just like,
don't bother.
Oh, here we go. Like, how can this be entertaining today? And this is one where I don't necessarily see this a whole bunch in terms of the people in our Discord and whatnot, but it's definitely something that it can really hinder you in the future in a league with a specific owner from getting a deal done because you have a certain expectation and it's not based in reality. I hate to put it that way, but that's what it is. So this is a great point. It's one that's hard to notice when you're doing it. This is one where it would help if you're in our Discord because we could be like, hey man, probably not going to get done. So great point here, Bob.
Your point kind of ties into this one a little bit in the same kind of vein. That's why it was moved here in the show sheet to be nice and fluid. But speaking of fluid, I guess let's talk about your next point here, Zach. What's your next mistake to avoid?
Yeah, I'm a big person one way or the other when a trade gets sent or a trade gets offered to me about understanding both parties here, right? I'm very much a believer in everything in life, that there are two sides to a story. I'm a very considerate of everybody's circumstances and willing to hear everybody out. And it's the same for trading for me. But if you don't do that, if you send out a trade that doesn't make sense for your opponent's timeline, trajectory, team build, so on and so forth, sending a low value trade to get a dialogue going. Like when somebody sends me a trade and it's like, just seeing where your head's at. It's like, I don't have time for this, man.
Hate it.
There's a difference, Bob, between letting me know that you're interested in somebody and just sending me a crap offer and wasting my time. I got offered the other day in a league where I'm projecting to have the 102, 103 in a rebuilding orphan takeover. And somebody offered me Joe Mixon for that first round pick. And instead of instant declining, explain to me how this 27, soon to be 28-year-old running back with pretty much no future guaranteed in Cincinnati is worth the 102, 103. I haven't gotten a response in days. And that tells me all I need to know. So avoid being that person. Make sure that if you just send a blind offer out, and I know that's something that I don't do that often, but if you do, make sure that it works for the opponent. That at least if there is a dialogue, you can say, I thought this worked for you because XYZ. Not because in my head it worked out for you, but be reasonable or be rational with your offers. And don't just send poor trade offers or low value trade offers to get a dialogue going. If you want to get a dialogue going, just at me. I'll talk to you all day long. You know this, Bob. But if you send me a stupid trade offer, I'm going to need your reasoning and your explanation before we move forward.
You know, whenever you send out a trade, you should be analyzing what is going on with that team. We talked about it in the trading strategy video. Go watch that after this one if you haven't already. You should be taking a look and doing your homework with what that team looks like. Does that team look like a rebuilding team? Does it make sense for them to be interested in Joe Mixon? Does it make sense for them to be more interested in somebody like Kendre Miller? So on and so forth. What is that going to look like in a trade offer for them? And if you're unsure, like you said, and you want to quote unquote get the dialogues, or I can't stand people who just try to get your thought process on where you're feeling about X player for way lower value than what they're worth on the market. Hate that. Don't do it. Just reach out. Hey, what are your thoughts on this player? Are you interested in acquiring them? Whatever the case may be. Do that. Don't just send the terrible trade. At least send a trade that makes sense. You know, you should have thought through it enough to at least have a reasonable explanation for why you're sending the deal. Because, you know, I think from the other side of things, you should be open and honest to just be able to ask, hey, man, this doesn't really work for me. I'm curious where your head's at with this, you know, and you can be as nice or rude about it, I guess, as you want. I'm going to lean towards being nicer about it for the most part. Unless you piss me off first, then I'm coming at you. But, you know, definitely don't send out poor trades. Send trades that make sense. Make trades that make sense. And don't be afraid to ask, hey, man, because honestly, you might not see why a trade might be good for you. But if the trade starts with, or their reasoning starts with, well, the player I'm trying to get from you isn't very good, that's when you know it's bogus and you should probably just move on from that conversation, hit the line, call it a day. Because I know from this example, like you discussed right off the rip, when I get that notification that X person sent me a trade offer, I know at this point they've damaged that relationship enough where I know that it's not going to be a good offer. I know it's not going to make sense for my team. I don't know why I'm still in a league with them, especially a couple leagues with them, but it's rough. Sometimes it's rough out there in the streets and in the sleeper DMs, to say the least. But in the same vein of sending offers, and my mistake here to avoid is sending or accepting overly complicated offers.
Oh yeah.
And now there's several reasons why to avoid this, but the number one thing for me is there's nothing I really dislike more than a complicated trade offer in my inbox with 5 or more pieces moving around, 5 or more pieces like on each side, or even four or more. To me, it's total turn off to the trade. I'm just not interested at trying to sit here with my dry erase board for the entire day, trying to reason and justify why these 5 players are worth these 5 assets. Don't want to do it. And the person you're sending them to probably doesn't either. 2, at the end of the day, it's just so hard to justify values because there's so many. It's hard enough to justify values when there's 1 or 2 people involved on each side, because there's so many variables of where that team is at, how these players are doing, how they're projected to be doing, where these picks are going to line up. There's just so many variables that when you throw in 5 pieces on each side, it just becomes impossible because, well, this trade could go anywhere, could go either way. And it could be super lopsided one way or super lopsided the other way. And we don't necessarily want that at the end of the day, especially if you're in a good, healthy league. You don't want to just have lopsided trades go through every day. When these trades come in my DMs, I'm barely looking. If ever, I'm usually going to just hit decline, call it a day. There are times where maybe if I got a minute, I'll take a look and see if there's, I'm okay with moving 1 or 2 pieces, maybe for 1 or 2 pieces on their side. Maybe see if there's an option that I can simplify. And that's the fix here. Keep your trade offer simple. Keep the offers that are coming in that you're considering simple. No more than 2 to 3 pieces per side. That's like max for me. I don't want to go any more than that. There's some cases where, you're going to be buying Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, where you might have a handful on one side that you're trying to kind of, especially if that team is just devoid of assets, you might be doing something like that. But in most cases, most trades without those players, stop trying to one-stop shop. If you're trying to get multiple assets or multiple players from a team, stay focused on the 1 or 2 players you're looking to add. I've had the most success with the bridge piece deals, where it's a 1-for-1 player, you know, a running back for a running back or a running back for wide receiver, so on and so forth, however you want to stack it up, one position for one position. And then to justify values, there's a draft pick thrown to either side that makes sense. You know, one player A is worth more than player B in the market. So player B has a draft pick along with it to justify what's done in the trade. That's the best luck I've had, where it's a 1-for-1 player swap with a draft pick kicker to bridge the value gap between the 2 assets that are originally in the deal. Anything beyond that, it's tough. It's, like I said, it's just tough to justify the values that are on the table. Always recommend simplifying if you are making or especially accepting these offers. There's a very good likelihood that, and this is not necessarily by design, that they're trying to like sneak pieces in to like fool you into thinking you're getting a better deal. But there's just more likelihood that you're going to miss something, underlook or overlook something where you're losing out on value. And that's what we don't want to do at the end of the day. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this point. Feel free to dive on in.
When you would first talk about this, when I joined the channel, I didn't really agree with it. Then I got in more leagues and more leagues, and this became more and more applicable. Yeah, this sucks, man. For the most part, this sucks. When somebody sends a trade out, and I have to sit there for more than 10 seconds to understand the trade. And then I'm in so many leagues. I gotta remember what the scoring is for the league. I gotta go back into the rule. I gotta do this. I gotta do that. Like, this is a great point. And when you put on the sheet, I was glad you did, because I just kind of chuckled, because we all have that person. Every one of these points, we have somebody like that in our leagues. Like, we know, sure. Oh, here we go, you know. And these, I've started to adopt the Bob philosophy when these trades come in. Like, how can we simplify this?
Yeah.
Or this is, I'm just not interested in it. I'm not interested in a complete overhaul. You know, if I'm a competitive team and I'm just not interested in an overhaul. Now, if it's like a 5-for-1, where like a rebuilding team's trying to get rid of 5 assets, okay. But if it's like 5-for-4, oh, and I got to figure out like who slots in where and the score.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I can't do that. And definitely as I've joined more leagues, having these kinds of trades, just it's not something, again, that I want to put too much time into. So I love this point. I'm glad that you brought it up.
The more simple you're able to make trades, if you can clearly show that, hey, this is a rebuilding team to a competitor team, you know, you can see where the value is for each side, why each side makes sense off the rip within that 10 seconds, like you said. Those are the trades that are going to get accepted. You know, when you can help a team with a need, help a team with a move that fits their trajectory, their timeline, whatever the case is, if you can do that simply, and that's what the point of these trading videos are, is to help you make more trades and, you know, avoid some of the mistakes along the way. This is one of them. Simple trades will do that for you. Simple trades will get more trades done, and it gives you easier starting points and kind of leaves things open to an easier counter if there's one needed too. With that said, Zach, why don't you go ahead, dive on into your next point. Like this a good bit. As always, we have good points. We do. So I want to hear this one from you. I want to hear what you have to say about this next one.
Yeah, I think it's a big mistake in any of your leagues that you're competitive in to literally go all in. I have a few leagues where, depending on the allowed years of draft picks being traded, you know, whether that's 2 years or whether that's 3 years, because depending on what platform you play, let's say Sleeper, where most of us play, you can trade draft picks up to the year 2026. There are teams that have traded all their draft picks in 2024, 2025, and 2026. That's a big mistake, because it just takes 1 or 2 injuries to then, I need a player, and then that person is posting on the league message board, and you go to look. This happened to me this week. Somebody needed a quarterback because of the Kirk Cousins injury, and I went to their team, and I'm like, what am I going to ask for? You are obviously going all in. I am obviously probably in a rebuild if I'm talking to this person who's going all in on a trade. What trade is going to make sense? Even your young pieces are like Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson, and I'm trying to offer you like a Geno Smith or something like that. You know, and this goes back to my other point. Don't offer a stupid trade. I'm not going to offer Geno Smith for Bijan Robinson. Now I'll say, hey, I don't see anything that works, but is Bijan available? So on and so forth. But don't be the guy that goes all in. Leave yourself some flexibility to make a midseason move. There are leagues where I have dealt my first and second round picks, and I think that's okay. But if you need an extra piece in the middle of the season, you know, you need to have those thirds, fourths, fifths available. I think in our Rewinders versus Patrons league, which we're both in, Bob, I don't have my first round pick. I think I might have my second, but I have a ton of third round picks.
Correct. Yeah.
So it's a situation where I'm willing to go in, but I have to leave myself some flexibility one way or the other. One way being I'm going to make a trade with some of these thirds and even my second, or I'm going to be able to do something in the draft to add to my team. Going all in and leaving yourself without any draft picks is a big, big mistake. You're going to have a lot of FOMO during the draft. I've seen it from that team that I'm talking about during the draft last year. Hey, whoever's on the board, I sent you a trade offer. Can you check it? It's very annoying, but it's like, you did that to yourself. So don't be that team. Leave yourself some flexibility midseason if you need to get a deal done. I'm very much a believer in, like, if you believe you're making a push, trade some draft picks, but don't trade them all. Don't trade all your draft picks. Make sure you have flexibility if you need to make a trade at some point.
Yeah, I love this point. I've been on the side that goes all in a little too hard and leaves yourself with not a lot of draft picks to work with. And it makes trades hard to get done because you don't, there's so many times where, I have one player, you have another. And like we talked about in the last point, you need that bridge piece to get it done. And I might need to be the one coughing up that bridge piece in some cases. I can't always, get that 2-for-1 done coming back my way, because if I'm a competitive team, especially like we're kind of talking in this scenario, I don't necessarily want to tear down off of production all the time. It's a huge point, something that we talked about a little bit coming into the season and that we've talked about with rebuilds and roster reviews is having a war chest and not unloading it before the season even starts or early on in the season. You want to be able to make trades to fill holes for a Kirk Cousins injury, for when Justin Jefferson goes down, and now you're not going to replace that production exactly, but you still need another wide receiver to fill lineup gaps throughout bye weeks and that injury, and God forbid any other injuries that come up. You need to have ways to fill this, having some draft capital kicking around. I don't ever want to get rid of all of it, because when you're in the draft, you're missing out. You're missing out on possible trade-up opportunities. If you're in the draft, you're in the draft, and it's kind of like the cool kids club. Once you're in, it's a lot easier to stay in and maneuver around the board than to trade into a draft without overpaying, because that switch that happens in the offseason where draft picks become so much more valuable than players because draft pick value insulates. And with that said, I'm going to roll right into my next point, Zach, if that's cool with you, because this next point dives into a lot of the mistake being mishandling draft capital while trading. And there's 3 avenues that I can pluck from my head at this point that really do it for me, that are kind of like the pinnacle or the most interesting or off-put mindsets. The first one being, that's kind of tied into your point, is ignoring the value of draft capital and overusing it to get deals done. Whether you just bought the best team you could with all the draft picks you could, especially early on in the season. Like if you still have some picks kicking around now and you're using them in the midpoint of the season to get deals done, I still don't want to deal all of it. I don't want to leave the cupboard bare, but now is a good time to start pushing some draft capital around if you got it, especially if they're looking like late picks. If they're your own picks, now is not the worst time to do it. My most hated mindset when talking about trading with draft picks is making the mistake of thinking, well, I have time to get the draft pick back. That's a 2025 pick. That's a 2026 pick. I lose my mind when that's a justification for getting a deal done. Because while it's factual, while you have 365 days times 1.5 to get that pick back, doesn't mean it's going to be any easier to get back. And that's the thing, is you're going to have to spend that much to get that pick back. So you're either kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, whatever the case is. If you're just doing a deal for value, I'm fine with it. Like, don't make that your justification for it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too as well. Another thing that drives me not bonkers, but just something I think leaves you open to possible mistakes and value loss, like we'll discuss a little bit later as well, or continue to touch on. When you trade with predictive landing spots in mind of draft capital, for example, like placing an early first round pick, mid first round pick, late first round pick, coming into this next draft specifically, we have a pretty clear 101 to 103 tier with the top 2 quarterbacks and Marvin Harrison Jr. However you want to shake those up as whatever. But an early first round pick next year is 101 to 104. And if you put a value, well, I'm gonna have a shot at Caleb Williams if I trade for this early first round pick. That pick might be 104. And now you're in, and especially if it's not your pick, you don't have any control over it. This is just one way that you can kind of get caught up, and that's a pretty extreme example, but I would say that the more the mid to late is the shift that happens, or early to mid, you don't go too crazy value shift wise, but it can happen. And now the fix for the mindsets on these is just like we talked before, when it comes to ignoring the value of draft capital, you need to understand that draft capital is so versatile when it comes to trading for players, drafting players, trading those picks for players when their value's at its peak before the draft, during the draft, etc. Having the mindset fix of, well, I have time to get that pick back. You do, but you also need to get that pick back. You're not just going to walk into 2024 and have an extra 25 pick kicked your way when the 27 draft capital comes in through sleeper after your draft is done. That's not how it's going to work. You're going to have to find a way to fulfill that value loss. And then trading using these predictive landing spots, I always try to protect myself as much as I can for when this happens. And it's as simple as, if I think a pick is going to be, if it's projected mid, but I think there's a chance it ends up late, like it's looking like a playoff team. When you're in the playoffs, it's pants off, dance off. That pick could be just as easily 107 as it could be 112 because things happen. Justin Jackson, Rex Burkhead, things happen. So when I'm doing that, if I'm predicting ahead of time or trying to, I'm going to try to pad some value into that deal in case that happens. As simple as trying to add a second round pick, trying to add a third round pick, a couple of thirds, whatever I can do to try to, if that draft pick were to land at 112 instead of 109, 108, whatever the case is, what would I need to trade up from that 112 to 109? And now, not every time is that deal going to get done that I try to add that. And that's, neither here nor there. That kind of is what it is. But I'm not going to leave myself open to just losing value because I was putting the value of 107 on this pick and it turned into 112. That's a huge difference in value. I'm not going to open myself up to that. So that's just something I want to keep in mind. And when you're talking early picks too, you can't project to 2025. I'm sorry. You can tell me this team is terrible, but things change and they change very quickly. It takes a Puka Nacua hit, a couple of players who weren't relevant to be relevant. It takes a Puka Nacua hit, a Gus Edwards, injury in front of him, a Kyron Williams popping off out of nowhere. All it takes is a couple things to happen when, a rebuilding team that looked like absolute trash that was able to get a bunch of picks on the roster is now performing above expectation. You were expecting an early 25 first. Now you have a mid to late 25 first. Congrats, you just lost value. It's a tricky game to play, and a 25 first is a random 25 first, or when you're 2 years out, it's random. Don't play the guessing game. I urge you not to. I always want to avoid playing that guessing game as much as I can because I don't want to be stuck with value loss for no reason other than I expected the pick to be better than it was. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts when it comes to mishandling draft capital while trading. Feel free to add any additional thoughts you have when it comes to, kind of mishandling draft capital. I'd love to hear it if you have any other additional points, and you in the comments as well. I love hearing you guys talk about other things you may think about that we may not have, because that's cool too. So Zach, I want to hear from you now though, through this microphone, your microphone, not mine, through my headphones. What do you got?
Yeah, this is definitely going to flow into my next point. I'll get into that in just a second, but I feel like you are talking directly to Michael Bauer.
No. Maybe.
Because I hear that a lot from him.
Yeah, maybe
in the videos with him and Nate. And I agree with you because yeah, you can get it back, but like I'm not the serial trader. I'm not the I'm going to trade you this guy, and in the offseason I'm going to try and trade back for him. And then we talked about this in one of our other videos. You know,
Yes.
I said this where I don't, you know, like your point was like Olave and Wilson are underperforming, move off them. Like, I don't really believe in that, you know. So to a higher extent, like, I don't move draft capital with the thought that I'm going to try and get it back, you know.
Sure.
That's just not my mentality. I'll worry about the draft at the draft, or, you know, January through March, where things are happening. Other people get bored. Other people do this. Other people do that. So I love that point, and I've heard it a lot from our very own CEO. So I thought that was kind of funny. It made me chuckle when you said it out loud.
One thing we have to touch on, Zach, before you touch on anything else, we had it in the comments, and this is why I had to ask: what is a serial trader to you? When you say serial trader, because it came up kind of out of nowhere in our videos all of a sudden, and I was hearing about it back-to-back videos. I don't know what it exactly means. So for the people that don't know what it means, but it is provocative, shout out Blades of Glory. What do you got, Zach, on that?
I think it's exactly what I talked about in my first point, the over trading, you know, where
that's what I thought. Where
you've had one owner, he had Travis Etienne, then he traded Travis Etienne, then he's traded for him again, and this and that. And it's like, dude, like, and a lot of times when people are doing that, they are minimally losing value each trade.
I love that point.
Yeah.
Because you're right.
It's like, but you had him already. Why did you move off of him and then trade more to get him back? Yeah. You lost value moving him and then trading back for him. Now, look, we've all done that for one player here or there, and that's fine. That's not what I'm saying. But we know the people who do that again and again and again, where it's like every trade that this person does, like, you already had that guy. Why did you move off? Like I said, I'm not the person that, like, I'm going to trade Olave and then try to trade back for him in the offseason. I don't do that. So it's just confusing to me when I see that, because like I said, most of the time you're not losing a whole bunch of value typically, but you are losing value in it's like a stock. Like you traded the stock at 40 cents and then you bought it back for 45 cents or whatever, you know. Right. That's a very penny stock right there. So probably a terrible example, but you get the point. You get the point, is you've lost a little bit of value in the reacquisition of the asset. So that to me is a serial trader.
Feel free to dive into your next point, kind of in the same vein a little bit, but either way, talk about it, Zach.
Yeah, I think a big one that I see a lot is accepting a deal that is under market value. And a lot of times this happens because people are looking to get deals done. I don't want to say this happens out of boredom trading, but I'll give you an example. I saw a trade in the league today where Derrick Henry was moved for 2 third-round picks. And that just sounds astonishing. It sounds like I'm making it up, but I'm not. And I was so confused at this trade because it does several things, right? And I actually voiced my opinion about this in the league chat. And I want to say this. I want to shut up, Bob. I want to say this. I want you to comment on this point, but let me know if this is true or not, because to me this exists. When I see a trade like that happen, that changes the scale in that specific league for me. 100%. Tell me I'm not making that up in my mind.
No, that's the type of trade that sets a precedent for aging veterans who are still productive, especially at Henry's level, still reasonably productive at that price. He's an awesome buy for a competitor, but it's not realistic. That's not really what his value shakes out to anymore. But that is exactly what that does. Is it just puts a horrible dent in the Mike Evans, Adam Thielen, Devontae Adams of the world, and you're probably still paying a little more for those guys. But yeah, it definitely hurts the value of anybody trying to move off of aging veterans at that point.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. That I had that here, and I'm like, is this something that only, because when I say that in league chat, people are like, well, no, it doesn't. I'm like, yes, it does, because you just set the market. You just reset the market with that. You know, it's sometimes it's hard to explain to people, but it's like, I'm trying to sell in that league, you know, Deontay Johnson, and somebody offered me a second, and now I look stupid for not accepting that because Derrick Henry just went for 2/3. You can't be the one that does this. You can't be the one in your league that does this. Not only because it's a black eye on you in the league, but it's a quick way to lose a lot of value. 9 times out of 10, if you just hold that asset, somebody eventually will give you what you want them to pay up eventually. I get the fear of like, this player is going to die on my roster, especially in the running back market. Look at Leonard Fournette, look at a bunch of these, James Robinson a couple of years ago, so on and so forth. I understand that thought process, but at the same time, I don't see Derrick Henry, even in the offseason, only moving for 2 third-round picks. You know, you can't be accepting deals under market value because you just want to get this player off your roster because you think their value is going to die out. So that's just the one example. It happened literally today as we were making the show sheet. I'm like, perfect, got a talking point. But I see this all the time. You know, I'm a big proponent of taking over orphans, but I'm not giving you my dollar for your 50 cents. Like, you're going to have to pay me $1, depending on what player it is. You're going to have to pay me $1.10 for what I have to offer. So don't do that, because it just makes your rebuild or your process of regaining that value. Like, you just lost Derrick Henry. You're not getting Derrick Henry back with the 3rd-round pick for the most part. It makes that process that much longer for you.
I've been here going through one of my earlier rebuilds back in the day. I traded a relatively valuable IDP player. Not that we're going to talk about IDP players today, but it's probably worth closer to a second, late 1st-round pick at the time. And I made the same kind of moves, moved him for 2/3. And it was one of those where I put him out on the block. Nobody seemed interested. I just said, I'm looking to move this guy. Ended up being an okay trade long-term. Shout out me, past me. But it is one of those things where immediately, I would have paid up this for it. Guy who hasn't been in the group chat for 5 weeks, I would have paid a 1st for it. And then the guy who bought him for 2/3 literally goes and sends it for a 1st down the block. And I'm just like, well, that's annoying. So, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with Derrick Henry. That's just one of those cases where if I would have done my due diligence and just kind of not either accepted the 1st offer that came in the door or looked for more aggressively for more offers and just kind of, gotten more people's DMs, gotten more people's faces, I probably would have gotten a better deal. Maybe not the 1st-round pick. I doubt I would have gotten hold of that guy. Like I said, he was gone for a month, and then all of a sudden, well, fine, screw you, I guess, whatever the case is. But, this is a case, I think this is very easy to do or very easy to fall into when you are highly incentivized to move a player. Like a Derrick Henry, if you're a rebuilding team or a team that the year just hasn't panned out for them, whatever the case is, you're highly incentivized to move some of these aging assets that we believe are going to fall off a cliff. You want to get them off your roster before they're worth nothing. I 1,000,000% am with you. I hate just having value die on my roster. I hate it. Every fiber of my being is against it, because that's the absolute last thing I want. But selling players just to sell, which is kind of what this deal is. We talked about it in the trading strategy video just off the rip. Maybe it might have been one of the rebuilding videos. You should probably just watch all of them just to be safe. Like and comment on those. Comment on this one if you haven't yet. When you're trying to sell and you can't necessarily get that exact price point you want, like I discussed in that video, whichever one it may be, it's a surprise at this point. Try selling, instead of selling for the quality of piece you're looking, try getting it in quantity and that is equivalent to the quality that you want. That's the move to make when you're caught in this kind of chokehold of trying to get good value for a player. Knock on every door you can. Hashtag knock on some doors. Leave it in the comments. Do it, somebody, please. And try looking for that quantity in place of the quality instead and go from there. Ask everybody you can. Don't be left holding the bag and losing value. It's the last thing we want and the last thing we'll talk about after a couple more points, though. Before we get to that, we have to get through this point here. And this is one of my absolute favorite points. I see it in the YouTube comments a lot. More justifications for making trades you maybe shouldn't have. But I'll say this, the point is just the mistake to avoid is just overspending just because you have an abundance of assets. If you have an abundance of assets, that's awesome. That's what we strive to do here at the Dynasty Rewind. We want you to build an asset pool so you can go make the moves, the big purchases when the opportunity is afforded to us. But I got to say this, just because you have an abundance of assets doesn't make those assets any less valuable. Write that down on a sticky note, put it on your forehead, whatever you have to do to remember it, put it on your phone. Just because you have an abundance of assets doesn't make them any less valuable. Just because you have 6 first-round picks next year doesn't mean you should go send 3 of them for a player that isn't worth 3 first-round picks. Just because you have 6 startable wide receivers doesn't mean you should go trade the 6th one for a 3rd or 2nd round pick when they're worth a first-round pick. That's Real simple is how that breaks down to. Again, we build up the asset pool to make those big purchases when they're afforded to us, not for the sake of throwing extra draft picks where they're not needed or warranted. Don't ever justify a trade that you made with anything close to, well, I had extra first, so I was okay with sending the extra one. Same goes for selling low on that position you have good depth in. Every piece is worth exactly the same, whether you have an abundance or not. Operate in a vacuum when it comes to situations like this. When it comes to handling asset value, operate in the vacuum. And I'll say it again one more time. Just because you have an abundance of assets does not make them any less valuable. You get that through your head. If anything, when you have an abundance of assets, because if you look at the market, not everybody has that same abundance. It should actually make them more valuable, especially when it comes to draft picks. If you have 6 draft picks and there's only 10 or 12 to go around, you own Boardwalk. You just got to shore up Park Place. That's what it is. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts here on this mistake to avoid. This is a big one for me, one of my favorites, one I always go back to, one I see in the comments a lot. It is what it is. I'm not saying you're bad people for it or nothing, but that's what we're here to talk about. Uncomfortable things, that mistakes are made during trading. What do you got, Zach?
I see it. The times that I see this the most are when people are trying to talk me into a trade. It's like, well,
Sure.
you have XYZ, and it's like, what does that have to do with the value of this trade alone?
Sure.
So I think sometimes that creeps in. Because this is something I when you put it on there, I thought about it for a second. It's nothing I've ever, at least on the surface level, I think I've ever done myself, is justify me doing a trade because I thought I had so much value. But I've definitely noticed when other people have done it, and it's usually been a dialogue within the league. Like, dang, dude, you just gave up a lot for something that probably cost 3/4 of that or whatever. So, I think a lot of times I see this more in the dialogues that I have. So I think that's for me where I'm looking for that. And I would say I'm adept at catching that, because again, it's like, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Let's say, if I only have one starting wide receiver and I start 3 and I need Devontae Adams, I'm not going to pay up more for that, right? So it works the same way when trading away assets. So it's a good point. I thought that, when we made this list, that there'd be some things that I hadn't considered. This was one. So I definitely think this is a good one for people to watch out for, because we are talking to a lot of people that, I would say a good amount of our audience participates in orphan leagues. And we've talked about this. And it's like, the orphan team, you got to get the draft capital, you got to get the pick, so on and so forth. So a lot of these teams have that excess draft capital, and you don't want to be moving that. You don't want to be moving that because you have an abundance of it. So I love this point here. It's a great one. It's one I hadn't really thought of until you brought it up.
I love hearing that, Zach. I appreciate it. You brought up an awesome point before the video. We were talking about this next point before we got into starting the video today. I love this. I think this is a great point in an area I think that can open up a lot of people's games if they're willing to buy into this narrative. I don't want to say narrative, but this mindset, this concept a little bit. Zach, talking this mistake to avoid in trading, it's a good one.
I'm trying to avoid always trading for players at peak value. Part of Dynasty, Bob, that we love so much is the long-term component of it, the ability to control the destiny of a team of our choosing, right? Part of that is doing the homework and believing in a player's talent or situation. I'm not the talent over situation guy. I believe in both sometimes. You have to be willing to trade for players before they blow up, Bob. By researching their situation, gauging the community's belief on a player, and reasoning and asserting your own knowledge and beliefs on a player is a way to avoid trading for a player before their value has increased, tenfold. A great one right now is Will Levis. We talked about Will Levis the other day. The only reason that I bought Will Levis in that video was because I thought I was buying at an appropriate value before a potential blow up, right? It's kind of like gambling a little bit. And I can see how people don't want to do that, especially me. We know I'm not the risk taker on the channel. I can see how people want to do that, but you minimize the risk sometimes by buying a player low. And you have to understand that you're not always going to get it right. Part of it is trying and failing, but at least you tried, because on some of them you will succeed. A lot of my Puka Nacua shares are not from drafting. They're from trading before the season. So You have to, and again, this is where I really believe in the community aspect, because Bob, how many times have I come to you for a trade that I'm not sure on? How many times have I posted in our Discord because I'm unsure? Like, just because I'm on this channel here doesn't mean there are not instances where I am unsure of a situation. And it really helps to have that community behind to pick their brains, to see what they think, to see what other people think, to see if I am on an island on the way that I think. So it's part homework, it's part community, and it's part gambling. Because if you always trade for a player, if you always wait for the blow up, you're not going to be able to buy as many players as you want. Either that or you're going to be giving up a lot of value each time, which is eventually going to take away from your overall build. Do some homework, have some belief in players, reach out to your Dynasty community. It doesn't have to be our Patreon. Could be the YouTube comments. I mean, look at our comments all the time. What do I do here? What do I do here? What do I do here? And then take a little chance, because you're not always going to hit on these players, Bob.
I think this is a great point. You know, avoiding waiting to buy in on players once they've reached their peak value, their breakout value, I guess you could say. Look for the opportunities like the Breece Halls of the world that were still low coming up before his, you know, he got back into it, back in the swing of things. Javonte Williams is somebody you're probably on the tail end of. You know, two guys at this point I'm kind of looking like I'm going to have to eat some crow on, but I still agree with the process at the end of the day. You know, look for these opportunities to not only create value, but to save the value you're having to spend on a player. You know, the 1 week difference can change if you're spending a first round pick or a second round pick with certain players. Josh Downs was a player this year who was still only worth about an early second round pick until just a couple weeks ago. Now you're looking like a tail end first. And I love Josh Downs. I'm still not in love with having to pay that price. Luckily, I drafted him in most leagues I could. Shout out to you for hooking me up with a draft pick to draft him in our patron league. I love this point. It's a very different concept of kind of, you know, you do open yourself up to some risk, which we don't love. We don't love doing that here at the Dynasty Rewind. You don't love doing that. I don't love doing that. But there is just one of the cases of sometimes it's a good way to increase the value that's on your roster. While you might be kind of, like you said, it's a bit of a gamble sometimes. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some, but it's all about believing in the player, believing in the process, believing in the prospect that you're looking at or the player you're looking at. Look at their situation for what it is. Make that buy while you still can. If you think even back to Puka Nacua, you know, he was still cheap week one after his blow up week one compared to what he's worth now. I mean, now he's a bona fide first round pick plus at this point. Back then it was maybe a late first, early second, or a pair of seconds you could get him for. Now there's just no chance because he's solidified his worth. I think if you wait for every player to do that, I think you made a great point of you're just not going to be able to buy as many players as you'd like to. And, you know, if you're trading, you're likely trying to buy some players. You're going to lose value if you wait on some of these guys. So definitely, you know, feel free, or not, don't do it all the time. I wouldn't say just do this willy-nilly. You think a guy's going to blow up. You think you see a sniff of improvement and it's wheels up, you know, I wouldn't go that far, but also make sure you're sticking to the current market value, because I think it'll be easy to talk yourself into, well, I'm very sure that this guy's going to blow up. I can pay the breakout price versus the market price. There's a certain wide receiver that a lot of players were talking about before the season that was being bought at breakout prices before the breakout. I'm not going to say names. People know who he is. Big Bird, if you're on our Patreon, you definitely know who he is. Some people won't know who that is, and I love that. I hope that's a thing. But and that's not the only player this was happening with, but sometimes players, when you're trying to do this, I could see people talking themselves into spending more than they have to. Even if you believe in a breakout, don't pay that price. You want to pay the current market value always. Maybe a little spend up. Maybe you throw a fourth round pick for some fun, for some jazz. I love this point, Zach. This is such a good point. It's one we haven't really discussed on the channel, and I love that you brought it up.
I think another way to avoid this too is, and I'm glad that you mentioned Breece Hall and Javonte Williams, is wait for a reason to be able to buy lower. You know,
sure.
An injury, or a lot of times right around February, March, when all the draft rumors come around. Oh, the Broncos are drafting another running back. Oh God. Like, We had that happen with Isaiah Pacheco, with Jonathan Taylor. Those were opportunities to buy low on those players because, like, oh God, they're going to draft another running back. What's going to happen? And those guys ended up being good. So, if you do want to buy a player, wait for an opportunity to, say, not pay the peak value.
To wrap up all these points, with my last point, I cheated. I took the easy way out on this one a little bit. I just wanted to kind of sum up everything that we're talking about. Big lesson of the day: to try to get more trades done. Along with this point, the point you can take away, the lesson of the day I put down on the sheet. This is all about avoiding value loss. We want to keep value on our roster and not just dole it out to the rest of the league. That's not what we want to do. So everything we've touched on today, for the most part, touches on that concept of keeping value on your roster as opposed to losing it throughout these mistakes. It's my opinion that at the end of the day, the team with the most value on their roster will win. Something I referred to in the past as the value bank, with that value being broken down into types of players from descending, ascending, prime players or players in the rookies, and even draft capital. All of these things. When you wrap all these points together, it's just about respecting the value bank, respecting the values of your assets. Keep that value on your roster. Don't just look for ways to, like I said, dole it out to the rest of the league at discounts. Not every value bank is going to be set up the same. You might have teams that are similarly valued across the board from top to bottom, but it's how that value is kind of dispersed that turns you into a competitive team, a rebuilding team, or an ascending team, however you want to word it. Build up that value bank, build up that pool of assets, that pool of draft picks if you're a rebuilding team, the war chest if you're a competitive team looking to make moves that help you win a championship, whatever the case is. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just wrap everything up. Talk about avoiding value loss before we get on out of here.
Yeah, again, this goes into like the being able to take a chance sometimes, but the way I try to at least minimize this is if it's a questionable trade, and you just said this 5 minutes ago, so ask for that 4th round pick. Like, ask for something to, if there's a situation where, like, listen, we've all bought a player and they get hurt the next week. Like, we've all had that value loss, and you can't avoid that. It's unavoidable. But there are ways to minimize the loss in a trade like that. So this is a good one. It's hard to always, because sometimes you lose the value in the future, and you don't
Sure.
realize it. You don't realize it. But sometimes you buy a player that has a lot of injury concerns. Sometimes you buy a player on a team that never takes care of that position, like the Patriots with running backs. Ramondre Stevenson before the season, then they go out and sign Ezekiel Elliott.
Easy.
Like, remember, I was never the Patriots running back guy, so we talked about that.
Right.
But there are ways to make it hurt less, so to say, because we're never going to totally avoid this. This is one, Bob, where you're never going to totally avoid. But if you can say, okay, at least I got that dart throw out of it, and maybe something can come of that, or maybe I can turn that 4th into a 3rd the next year. There are different ways to minimize this. This is a tough one to completely avoid because you're not going to, and you said this earlier, you're not going to win every trade. You're not going to come out of every trade being like, I did good on that one. Sometimes you're just going to miss. I traded Khalil Herbert before the season for Juju Smith in one league. That one looked real good at the time, but sometimes you just lose, and you have to be okay with that.
I love the point of, just adding that little buffer of value, whatever the pick value is. And that goes for, like, if you're adding, these aging vets for a 1st round pick. To maintain value on your roster for the long term, get another draft pick in there. Get a 3rd round pick. People love throwing in 3rd round picks for nothing. There are not a lot of people. There is a hive of believers out there that just don't buy into draft capital, and they're just willing to throw it around for whatever it is. And these are the people, when you look at their roster, they don't have a lot of draft capital kicking around. They probably don't have their 1st. They probably don't have their 2nd. They might have their 3rd, 4th, and 5th. If they don't have those that 1st and 2nd, they're probably willing to move on from that 3rd pretty easily to get a 1st round pick back on their roster. If you think about it that way, not necessarily sure they'd be selling Devontae Adams at that point, but maybe they decided that their season wasn't really going as well as they thought. But it's just something to think about when that is the case. Maybe he's an extra player, whatever the case is. Also, don't really love the idea of buying Devontae Adams right now. Just want to throw that out there. It's just kind of one of those cliches that you talked about. I'd rather go buy a Mike Evans at this point for that same cost. But with that said, Zach, wrapping this thing up, appreciate y'all for watching. That's going to be it for us today in this one. But before you make the biggest mistake of not liking the video and leaving a comment below, letting us know what mistakes you've encountered in Dynasty Fantasy Football, mistakes you took away from this video that you're never going to make again in Dynasty. As we've discussed throughout the course of the video, hop on over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in the Patreon Discord server. That is where we talk about a ton of trades, trade advice, strategy, so on and so forth. But for me and Zach, that's going to be it for us in this one today. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.